You are listening to the podcast of the Mathias Corvinus Collegium, the largest talent management institute in Hungary. If you want to know more about our mission, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or check out our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter channels. For interesting articles and analysis of our professors, external contributors, and students, look up our knowledge base at corvinec.hu/en.
Welcome everyone, you are listening to the new podcast episode of the Mathias Corvinus Collegium. My name is Szabolcs Janik, researcher of the Center for Political Sciences MCC. In today's episode, we will discuss the impact of Hollywood on US culture and the politics of Hollywood. And I have the honor to welcome Stephen Sholl, member of the Center for Architecture at MCC. Thanks, Stephen, for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, if someone thinks of Hollywood, they inevitably associated with the American culture. Where did the story of the Dream Factory begin?
It's a really fascinating story, and it was only in preparation for this research topic that I actually kind of discovered the story of Hollywood, because it's actually quite odd that such a major industry like the motion pictures would be so concentrated in basically what is now a suburb of Los Angeles. And there was actually a couple of reasons why Hollywood became Hollywood. The motion picture industry began in the early 1900s. In California, especially Southern California, with its long days and fairly warm weather, it became a great place to shoot pictures, especially things like if you think of Western pictures, which were a huge early movie genre. It became a great area to shoot around the clock, because of course back then they didn't have advanced lighting or whatnot. You had to shoot in the daytime. And then California also had rather loose patent laws where, you could kind of copy ideas that other people were doing, especially with plots and movies. And so it enabled a lot of movie companies to move to California in order to essentially work in a more liberal field, liberal referring to regulatory. So they were able to kind of essentially copy other movies and ideas and plots a bit more. And so that's kind of how Hollywood grew and developed and became almost exclusively located in Los Angeles. Really, by the 1920s and 30s, I believe every production company was in Los Angeles by that point. So within 20 years of the start of the movie industry, Los Angeles becomes the heart of it.
Perhaps we are not mistaken if we claim that Hollywood became the number one exporter of American culture and values all around the world. And when did this process start, and what factors drove it?
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting idea because, of course, if we look at, I think, before World War II, by no means was America the monopoly of the media world. You see, especially in Germany, right? You see a lot of very well-known movies, Nosferatu, to think of one as one of a very famous vampire movie from the 20s, which I think was German, French film industry. So I think by in the 20s and 30s, America was just one of many media empires. But of course, you have the cataclysm of World War II. And Europe is just so devastated that really the only media empire that is uninterrupted is the American media empire. And then, of course, after World War II, you have half the world come under the hegemony of the United States. And so then they get more exposed to American culture. And so I think you really see that essentially the influence of Hollywood is directly synonymous with America's influence as a world power. It's something that as America gets stronger or its influence gets more widespread, you see Hollywood's influence get more widespread. And the development Hollywood and movies are just like any other medium, like books. If it's something that can be reproduced and distributed, it's a great way to get your influence throughout the world.
You mentioned that this power thing, and definitely the promotion of American culture and values beyond U.S. borders can be considered a sort of soft power. Which was the first U.S. administration to recognize this, and how did they utilize it? What kind of values and interests were packed in various films? And is there a direct influence at all, or and if so, could you mention some evident examples?
Yeah, well, obviously, I definitely think Hollywood is a great example of a soft power, but you really don't see this develop until the years up to World War II. Especially in the 20s and 30s, or really the 30s, Hollywood was governed by a strict regulatory code known as the Hays Code. And this was, it's mostly known now for how strictly it regulated things like sex and violence. It was very, very strict. But it also insisted on apolitical movies. It thought essentially movies were where one should go to escape the problems of the world, and that for Hollywood to bring in political concepts, it would essentially demean the industry. But you see in the late 30s, with the rise of fascism, you start seeing Hollywood begin producing political movies, kind of movies that argued a political point. And I think it's especially relevant because Hollywood was started by a lot of immigrant communities. There's actually a lot of Hungarians in Hollywood. The Fox production company was started by a Hungarian. I think the Paramount one as well, and several leading Hungarians. And a lot of these Hungarians were of Jewish origin. And so, of course, when you see the rise of Nazism and these guys, probably have still relatives in these fascist countries who are experiencing persecution, you see them start pushing for films that attacked the fascist. And actually, there was a lot of originally pushback against the United States by the United States government against this. So instead of wanting to use Hollywood to kind of expand its influence, the government actually didn't want Hollywood to get political. There was a lot of Americans who didn't want to get involved in World War II, and they thought Hollywood producing anti-Nazi films would encourage the United States to go to war. So it really wasn't until World War II that you actually see positive government encouragement. And that's really when Hollywood goes propaganda. So World War II happens, Pearl Harbor is attacked, and the army and government use Hollywood as a way of galvanizing public opinion in the United States. You see everything from the Looney Tunes to Walt Disney producing propaganda films for the United States. In fact, many actors, it's hard to think of it these days, many actors wanted to sign up for the military, but the U.S. government refused because they said it's more important for you to be doing movies. It's more important for the U.S. government. And so you start seeing the U.S. government in World War II really utilize Hollywood in order to help both support its war effort and, essentially in many ways spread its culture throughout the countries like the United Kingdom. A lot of the big Hollywood blockbusters of World War II were really big in the United Kingdom. Of course, they weren't that big in occupied countries, but in allied countries that weren't occupied, Hollywood became a big player because, of course, they were all fighting the same side of the war, so they liked seeing that. And so that's kind of the origin of, I think, the United States government using Hollywood in order to advance its specific geopolitical interests.
And if you jump a bit of in time, one can have the impression that Hollywood became the fortress of the U.S. liberal elite over decades, be the topics of many movies or public remarks by, among others, American actors, directors, or producers. What were the milestones in this process, or where did this trend change? You just mentioned.
So, as I mentioned, the U.S. Hollywood was governed by a pretty strict code, really until the early 60s, the Hays Code. And that really restrained Hollywood in a lot of ways. You see occasionally political movies coming in. One can think of, for example, Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator. He ends this comedy with this very passionate liberal internationalist speech about how all man needs to unite together in order to, tear down tyranny. And actually, he was attacked for that, greatly for bringing politics into Hollywood. Really, you don't see Hollywood come into its own political mindset until the 50s and 60s. Of course, one of the big milestones and a big concern for the U.S. government was the presence of communists in Hollywood. In the 40s and 50s, a congressional committee called the House Un-American Committees, or House Committee on Un-American Affairs, began investigating Hollywood. And through their investigation, it's often lambasted nowadays, especially by Hollywood, as being this witch hunt. If you actually go through the records, they uncovered dozens and dozens of screenwriters, directors, actors who were actually card-paying members of the Communist Party. So the Soviet Union, really in its attempt to subvert the United States, wasn't doing it through mass conversion, but really doing it through selective conversion and converting important figures into these communist circles. And Hollywood was one of the biggest centers for that. Even in the 50s, there was reports that screenwriters prevented, Arthur Kessler's Darkness at Noon. They were going to make a Hollywood movie, but the screenwriters prevented it because they knew it would put communism in a bad light. And so you really see in the 50s this really growing concern over communist influence in Hollywood. And there really was. There were several films at this time that, produced, that started doing things like questioning. There was a lot of, you started seeing the start of the anti-war film in the 1950s that either kind of ridiculed the US military as incompetent or just the military in general as incompetence. And of course, this not only is a trope of American liberalism, but also goes in with their communist affiliation. Because of course, in the Cold War, if you support the Soviet Union over the United States, you're going to want to essentially demoralize the United States. You're going to want them to think, don't fight communism. Don't try and stop it in places like Korea or Vietnam. And so you see this in the 50s. And then I would say what we often think of now is not necessarily Hollywood as communist, but Hollywood as social liberals, and you start seeing this come out in the 60s. Because with the decline of the Hays Code, you start seeing Hollywood directors be more open with going with political movies. And in the 60s, you start seeing Hollywood take strong stances on things like the civil rights. So in the United States in the 60s, you had this push for the civil rights movement. African Americans faced discrimination in countless areas in the United States, and you start seeing movies about that. And 99% of them were very strongly against things like segregation. Just to name a few things like To Kill a Mockingbird or Look Who's Coming to Dinner. These were groundbreaking films that addressed issues such as wrongful conviction and interracial marriage. Because Hungarians may not know this, but things like segregation was legal until 1964. Interracial marriage was illegal in several places until like 1967 or 68. So the 60s were a groundbreaking change, and Hollywood was always on the forefront. Not to go too much into detail, but other topics they discuss or push were things like women's rights as well. In the course I teach on politics of Hollywood, I always point out in the 60s, you start seeing women depicted differently. In the 50s, women are depicted as as housewives, mothers. And then in the 60s, you start seeing independent women portrayed in Hollywood, women who don't want to get married. And of course, that was groundbreaking. And it reflects this crystallization of Hollywood as a liberal institution, pushing these progressive ideas, some good, some bad.
And the Democrats realized this and brought these topics onto their agenda, or was it the other way around?
It's definitely always a chicken and egg situation, right? Which came first? I definitely think Hollywood was always groundbreaking because these movies that I mentioned often scandalize the public. And if the public's already liberal, these movies aren't going to scandalize them. And I think especially with things like the sexual revolution, it really was groundbreaking because, if you look at statistics, in the 1960s, the vast majority of Americans believed things like sex before marriage was wrong. That was just the common belief. And you start seeing films, which was very radical at the time, characters having sex before marriage, or at least heavily implied, or things like adultery talked about. And I think that has to have an effect because, we as humans, we always reference things in our beliefs. And I think, I can't tell you how many times I reference TV shows I know, characters, even dressing like characters. There's several haircuts that famous TV show characters have had that people copy. And I think the same is true with the, actions they do. And I think it was absolutely influential in kind of this both women's liberation and sexual revolution for women and men to see characters on TV doing things that they thought, oh, we can't do that. But then if your main character's doing it on TV, why can't you? You're rooting for him. I mean, your preacher might say it's wrong, but you like the main character. If he can do it, why can't I? And so I think it was definitely influenced politics and culture more so than politics influenced Hollywood.
And if you look at the most recent period, how did the values promoted in American films and series change over the recent decades, and what factors drove this process? And is Hollywood a trendsetter or a trend follower in this regard, if you look at these kind of new values? So what are these? And I'm quite sure that most people have already heard of wokeism, cancel culture. Are these new values, if there are so, centered around these concepts, these ideological categories?
Yeah, well, I think there's always been a constant evolution of Hollywood's political stances. But usually I would say in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, I've already mentioned, for example, women's liberation, the sexual revolution, are topics that movies and TV shows heavily promoted. And then you also have things like, and starting in the 70s and 80s, you start seeing homosexuality displayed, which is another example of how Hollywood was a trendsetter because 1975, probably 95% of Americans, didn't know a homosexual, or at least probably did not even know one. And yet you start seeing Hollywood include them in things. And so that's going to be something that's going to normalize it. I even found, in doing research, there's a TV show, a fairly well-known from 1975. It was called Medical Center. It was about a hospital. It had a transgender episode. 1975. Talk about a trend setting. And in it, they make sure to use the right pronouns. They call this man who thinks he's turning into a woman brave. So you would almost think it's something you could see in 2022 or 2023, but it was 1975. And so you see Hollywood consistently promote this progressive social agenda, which emphasizes this kind of, we need to accept everyone. Everyone should be accepted. We shouldn't judge people. And like I said, in TV shows, you constantly will see plot lines where, there's the bigot neighbor, that the main character has to deal with. Maybe one neighbor moves in and they're unmarried, or one neighbor moves in and they're living with someone who they're not married. This would be in the 60s or 70s. There would always be like a bigot neighbor they would introduce who would judge them. And then that would be the bad guy. And so it encouraged the viewers to be like, don't be like the bigot neighbor. Be like the main character and accept this alternative lifestyle. And so I think really this promotion of alternative lifestyles you see growing in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and 90s. And then in the 2000s and 2010s, it just develops into what we know as wokeism, which is really just more radicalized, more absolute version of it. And you also just see the takeover where obviously this stuff was in TV shows in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but you could still find plenty of shows that didn't talk about politics. You could find very innocent shows through most of the history of Hollywood. But people have noticed now, and especially the 2010s, every show is now political. Every show is now pushing a cultural agenda. There is no show you can watch which doesn't include these things. And I think that's what people really notice the change is. This stuff was always there, but it was always just in the background, and now it's in the foreground of Hollywood.
And are the American people happy with this situation, or do you know any surveys how they view this politicization of every TV shows, TV programs?
I think essentially since it's lost its subtlety, Americans have started to realize this stuff is pushing it. There was a recent cartoon show came out called Velma that was lambasted. It has like one of the lowest IMDb scores. And it's this retelling of the Scooby-Doo series, which was the story from the 60s, very innocent. This group of 5 kids or 4 kids and a dog, they solve mysteries. Very, very innocent, kid-friendly. And in this new cartoon show, they've made it adult. So, there's violence, language, nudity, I haven't seen it, but I've only seen clips from it. Nudity, they've race swapped everyone. So originally, of course, all the kids were white, and now, one of them's white, and that's the bad guy, that's the jerk. And really, from clips from this I've seen from the show, it's nonstop, things we think of wokeism. It's anti-white jokes, it's anti-men jokes. All they do is make fun of the one remaining white cast member and joke about him just being an idiot, and comments. And people didn't like that. People have good memories. They want to watch innocent stuff. They don't want to be lectured. But Hollywood's kind of so convinced of its own righteousness that, it's turning everything into this very self-righteous propaganda. And so a lot of people are upset. But, I think in many ways, people don't realize, though, that it's always been heading in this direction. It's kind of like, when you boil a frog slowly, the frog never leaps out of the pot. And this is kind of what Hollywood's been doing. It's just we now realize the pot's boiling, but it's been heating up for the past 50 years. And especially with, like I said, I mentioned, there was transgenderism was being pushed by Hollywood as early as the 1970s. So this is not something that just jumped out of nowhere. It's something that's been changing, and it's definitely a trendsetter. And I think it explains why, a lot of Hungarians, when I tell them about things that are these woke ideas, they're like, oh, that could never happen here. But, it used to never be able to be happen in the United States. And I think a lot of the reasons why the United States has succumbed to it is because of things like Hollywood, because they've normalized it. In many ways, Hollywood doesn't have to push something, even if you just include it, without criticizing it, praising it, you normalize it, and that can sometimes be good. I don't think it's wrong to normalize interracial relationships. I think that was a good thing Hollywood did. But with other things, like transgenderism, I think it's very bad to normalize it, especially with a young group of people. And you have, kid shows, that, I show the kids in Hungary to scare them a little bit, a TV show I grew up with called Blue's Clues. And, they had a Pride Parade episode with transgender, poly people, and this is for 4-year-olds. So I think that's the reason people are now getting upset. It's so obvious now. But it's been heading in this direction for a while.
Do you see any chance of a counter trend based on this resistance unfolding in the future?
There's always the possibility. I mean, throughout these the decades, there's always been movies that have bucked the trend. In the 1970s, for like the right, I try and show some kind of right-wing films to balance out all the left-wing films in my course, but it's obviously a little bit difficult to do. In the 70s, there was, for example, the Dirty Harry movies, which was done by Clint Eastwood. He plays this, rugged cop. And this was at a time where, the U.S. was liberalizing its criminal justice laws, starting to give a lot of criminals rights, the right to, all those rights to remain silent you hear in those police movies. Those all came about in the 60s and 70s. And this was also happened during a crime increase. And so there was a lot of feeling in America that essentially, liberals were kind of letting us, be at the mercy of criminals. And so here comes along Dirty Harry in a series of movies where he's this no-nonsense cop, to him, the best suspect's a dead suspect, very unapologetically, throughout his movies, he encounters, he always has to be fighting a liberal city hall. He's a cop in San Francisco. So it's a movie that very much bucks the trends of the 60s and 70s by very much praising this very masculine law and order guy. And it was actually attacked as fascist when it came out. It was the liberal media called it a fascist movie because it portrayed a police officer in a good light, basically. And of course, you have other movies, I think, that are quite bucking the trend. In the 70s, you had a lot of nihilistic sci-fi movies. If you look at sci-fi movies in the 70s, very depressing. Like it's the end of the world, overpopulation. But then you have Star Wars come along. And Star Wars is unapologetically non-nihilistic. There's good guys, there's bad guys. You know who the good guys are, and the good guys always win. And that revolutionized the film industry. And that kind of ended in many ways the nihilism of movies from the 70s. And you start seeing things like Steven Spielberg movies, which are very similar. There's always a good guy. You root for the good guy wins. I mean, that's the basic premise of most Spielberg movies. So I think there's always the potential for that ground-changing film to come along. But the issue is Hollywood is so convinced of itself that basically nowadays, I think to kind of reverse the trend, you would basically just have to create another Hollywood staffed by entirely different people, and then somehow convince Americans to watch that instead. I don't think Hollywood's ever going to reform itself. It's very unapologetic in its provocative ways.
Streaming providers are becoming increasingly popular these days, in many cases with original productions, not only from America, but also from other countries all over the world. Does this trend or the emergence of streaming providers influence the impact of Hollywood? And if so, in what direction is it possible?
Well, I definitely think it helps expand the influence of Hollywood. I mean, I talk to a lot of the MCC kids here. Almost all of them have Netflix, and or HBO Max. I see the commercials, and so I think streaming has helped expand America's influence. Just the whole streaming idea, the idea you can just not even have to rent a CD or go to the movies. You literally can just watch it from your computer. That increases the influence of Hollywood to unprecedented levels. And I think it's something that, especially with how political Hollywood has become, or overtly political, I should say, it's something that I think is quite dangerous. It's a dangerous combination. And you see a lot of the streaming shows be some of the most woke shows out there. Velma, I believe, was a streaming show. You have a lot, I'm not a Lord of the Rings person, but you had a lot of Lord of the Rings people very upset with the new TV show that came out. You also have, I know of a lot of the Disney Plus shows, which are streaming, are quite woke. That being having, very overt, gender ideology, et cetera, content in it. And I think that is quite a predicament because it's something that can now be available everywhere. It's something that, your kids can watch on your iPod or their computer. And so it's a very not deadly, but a very dangerous combination, especially for the rest of the world, just because now, you really do have an American TV in your room because you have your laptop, you have your whatever device you use to watch TV. You now can basically see whatever Americans can see. And a lot of why America is the way it is because their TV's been a certain way. And so I think it's actually a quite of a predicament we're in right now. And I think it's something that needs to be pushed back in many ways.
And can non-American productions available on streaming providers counterbalance somehow, or do they follow suit?
I mean, I think outside the Western world, I think within the Western world, a lot of them just follow suit. But I think outside the Western world, I don't watch a lot of non-Western media, but I see films from like Bollywood where they just look so fun. And I can't remember the last time Hollywood's produced a fun movie, something that's just totally lighthearted. And I see some of the clips from their dancing movies or productions where it's basically just a lavish musical. And I think a lot of that has the potential to push back. I think you'll see a lot of alternatives rise up, which is the one good thing about streaming, is you're not at the mercy of the cable companies or the TV companies or what have you. If you can produce a website that people can go to, you can produce alternatives. But I think it's something that a lot of, if you're worried about this kind of negative woke influence from the United States, it's something that you're going to have to start wondering whether or not, even just as a family, you regulate, watching this kind of American influence. Because I know for me, if I when I have kids, I know now if I were watching American shows, I have to watch every single show before I show it to my kids. I even know if they're 1 year old, I'm going to have to watch every single episode before I show it to them because I don't know what they're going to say. I can't trust anything anymore. And if you told me 10 years ago I couldn't trust Disney to show my kids a family-friendly film, well, we've definitely gone a far way.
Thanks, Stephen, for sharing your thoughts on this interesting and current topic. And dear listeners, today you had the chance to listen to the cultural impact and politics of Hollywood with Stephen Sholl. Thank you for following the MCC podcast, and please stay tuned for the upcoming episodes as well. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you for listening to this MCC podcast episode. For further media content, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you want to read more by our professors, external contributors, and students, check out our knowledge base at corvinec.hu/en.